To Miss Lavinia Musgrave, at the parsonage of Nethercompton in the county of Dorset. These, madam, you do not know my name, and I have made it the labor of my last winter to be certain that you should learn it kindly rather than coldly, and from my own hand rather than from the dry recital of a stranger in black. I am your mother's cousin. My name is Josiah Merrick, and I am, as you read this, some weeks or months in my grave, at Aldermere Grange in the parish of Bodenham in the county of Hereford, where I have lived these 40 years among my glasshouses and my woods and my folios of pressed leaves, a bachelor, a botanist, and a man of no great consequence to any living soul but the 2 gardeners who kept my paths swept. I never once wrote to you in my life, and I ask your pardon for it now, when pardon can cost me nothing, and may seem therefore worth very little. But I did not neglect you for want of knowing you. 3 years ago there came into my hands, by way of the printseller in Ludgate who supplies my colored plates, a slim folio of drawings of the ferns of the western counties, done in watercolor by a lady who signed herself only with the initials L.M., and offered at $1 the sheet for the benefit of a Dorset charity school. I bought the whole. I have them framed along the passage that leads to my breakfast room, and I have shown them to every man of science who has crossed my threshold, and I have said to each of them, "That is my cousin's daughter," though the man to whom I said it did not know I had a cousin, nor a cousin's daughter, nor indeed that I had spoken to a human creature about anything but capillary threads and the undersides of fronds in 11 years. Your heart's tongue, madam, on the 4th sheet, is the truest drawing of that plant I have ever seen set down by any hand in England, and I include in that reckoning the hands that are paid handsomely by the booksellers of the Strand. You have looked at the thing itself. You have counted the sorry along the ribs of the back of the leaf and set them down as they are, and not as the engravers suppose them to be. And I, who have spent my life looking at the thing itself and being thought a fool for it in a county that measures a man by his cover side and his cellar, knew when I saw your 4th sheet that I had a kinswoman in the world after all, and that when I died the Grange need not go to the wall, or to the auctioneer, or to the primrose, waistcoated gentleman in Hereford, who has these 10 years inquired, after my health with the tenderness of a heron watching a pool. It is yours. All of it is yours. The house, the home farm, the 240 acres, the woods that run down to the Lug, the fish stew, the 4 glass houses, the fern house that I built with my own drawings and a Dutchman's iron in the year 1809, the folios, the presses, the 4,000 pounds in the 3%, and the labor of 40 years, which is the only thing a man truly leaves behind him and the only thing the law has no words to convey. Come and see it before the frost. The tender ferns will want you by October. My solicitor, Mr. Hetherington of St. Owen Street in Hereford, will tell you the rest in language I could never abide. I remain, madam, though you never knew it and I never earned it, your affectionate cousin, Josiah Merrick. So the letter ran, in a hand grown spidery at the last lines but firm at the first, and Miss Lavinia Musgrave read it through twice at the parsonage breakfast table on the 14th morning of September in the year 1816, with a rack of cooling toast at her elbow and a shallow tin of fern fronds gathered from the churchyard wall at her other hand, half pressed between 2 sheets of blotting paper and forgotten now entirely. She was 29 that autumn, a clergyman's orphaned daughter who had kept her late father's successor's house for 4 years in exchange for her board and a bedroom under the eaves, and she had the sort of face that strangers called plain until she began to speak of the thing she loved, when it altered so completely that they went away afterward disputing among themselves whether she was handsome or not. She had chestnut hair pinned without much ceremony, ink upon the second finger of her right hand that no pumice ever quite lifted, and gray eyes that had the trick of going very still when she was thinking, so that people who did not know her supposed her cold, and people who did know her understood that she was merely, in those moments, entirely elsewhere. She did not weep over the letter. She set it down, and she looked for a long while at the pressed heart's tongue under the blotting paper, and then she took up the letter again and read only the part about the fourth sheet, and it was there, and there alone, that her composure gave a little at the seam. For no one in the whole of her life had ever told her that she had looked at the thing itself. Her father had thought her drawing a harmless female accomplishment, useful chiefly because it kept her quiet. The rector she now kept house for thought it a small vanity to be indulged so long as the linen was counted and the puddings came up on time. The parish thought her a spinster with a hobby, and here was a dead man she had never met, 40 years and 3 counties away, who had bought the whole folio at $1 the sheet and hung her ferns along his passage and told the men of science that she had counted the sorry as they truly were. She folded the letter along its old creases and put it inside the cover of her fern book, where it stayed. Then she rang for the girl to clear the toast, and went to find the rector in his study to tell him that she would, after all, be leaving Nether Compton, and that she was very sorry to give him such short notice, and that she hoped Mrs. Pruitt from the village might be prevailed upon to come in until he was suited. The rector, a kindly, absent, comfortable man named Dr. Solers, who had never in 4 years inquired what she thought about anything, looked up over his spectacles and said, "Leaving us, Miss Musgrave. Whatever for, and where?" And she told him, in Herefordshire, a house from a relation. And he said, "A relation I did not know you had any." And she said no, and neither did I. The second letter, the one from Mr. Hetherington of St. Owen Street, came 3 days after the first, having been delayed by the same September rains that had swelled every ford between Hereford and the coast. And it was everything the dead man had promised it would be, dry, exact, and written in the language he could never abide. It gave her the particulars. It named her as sole devisee under the will of Josiah Merrick, gentleman, deceased the 11th of August last, of Aldermere Grange, and it set out the estate in the flat music of the law, the capital messuage, the home closes, the greater and lesser woods, the water meadows along the river Lug, the mill let to a tenant at £42 the year, the 4 glasshouses and the iron fern house, the library, the botanical folios and pressed collections, the household plate, and the £4,000 in the consolidated annuities. It asked her pardon, with a stiffness that somehow made the apology more affecting than any warmth could have, for the delay in reaching her, which had arisen, Mr. Hetherington wrote, from the late Mr. Merrick's own strict instruction that his private letter should be delivered into her hand before any communication from this office, and from the difficulty, the winter being severe, and Mr. Merrick a man of retired habits, of establishing beyond the possibility of doubt the identity and direction of the lady he had named. It requested that she would signify her intentions at her early convenience, and it offered, should she wish to view the property, to have the housekeeper, Mrs. Pendlebury, and the steward, Mr. Trewin, hold themselves in readiness to receive her, and it remained her most obedient humble servant, Bartholomew Hetherington. She read this one only once. She did not need to read it twice, for it told her nothing about the fourth sheet, and everything about the fact that she was now, incredibly, at 29, with £11 of her own in the world, and a box of pressed ferns, the owner of a house in Herefordshire she had never seen, left to her by a man she had never met, on the strength of a shilling folio she had drawn for the roof of a charity school. She sat with the 2 letters side by side on the breakfast table for a long while that evening, after the household was abed, the candle burning down, and she found that the thing which moved her was not the £4,000. though she was too sensible a woman to pretend the £4,000 meant nothing to a person who had 11. And it was not the 240 acres, which she could not so much as picture. It was the iron fern house that he had built with his own drawings and a Dutchman's iron in the year 1809. And the sentence, "The tender ferns will want you by October." A house she could refuse. Acres she could sell. But somewhere in Herefordshire, in a glasshouse that a dead man had raised for the love of the same small green things she loved, there were living ferns that would want water and shade and a knowing eye before the frost came. And there was no one left in the world to give it to them but a plain spinster in Dorset, who had counted the sorry as they truly were. She wrote to Mr. Hetherington the next morning in a clear round hand that betrayed nothing of the night's watching, to say that she was very sensible of his attention, that she accepted the trust and the charge that had been laid upon her, and that she would come to Aldermere Grange as soon as a place might be got on the coach and the roads would bear it. For she was anxious, she wrote, to see the glasshouses established for the winter, and she would be obliged if Mr. Trewin would in the meantime keep the fern house fire alight both morning and evening, and admit no frost, however slight, upon any account. Mr. Hetherington, reading this reply 4 days later at his desk in St. Owen Street, turned it over in his fingers and read the postscript about the fern house fire a second time. And then, being a man of 33 years' practice, who had watched a great many heirs receive a great many fortunes, and had seen almost none of them, in the first flush of it, spare a thought for anything that could not be counted or spent, he set the letter down and said aloud to the empty office, to nobody, in the tone of a man laying a small bet with himself that he already knew he had won, "Well, he kept it whole for you, Mr. Merrick. And it seems she means to keep it whole for him." The leaving of Nether Compton took her the better part of a fortnight, not because there was much to pack, for a woman who owns £11 and a box of ferns is soon packed, but because a parsonage does not run itself, and Lavinia Musgrave was not a person who could walk out of a house she had ordered for 4 years without first seeing that the person who came after her would find the salt where it ought to be, and the account book squared to the last farthing. She trained Mrs. Pruitt to the linen. She wrote out in the same clear round hand 3 pages of directions upon the working of the kitchen range, which had a temper, and the airing of the best bedroom, which had a damp corner, and the particular Sunday on which the sexton expected his half-year's money. She walked once more up the lane to the churchyard and lifted, very carefully, with a table knife and a great deal of patience, 3 young crowns of the hart's tongue that grew in the shade of the north wall where her father lay, and she potted them in a little tin box with their own soil about the roots and a wetted cloth over the top, so that some green thing of Dorset might travel with her into Herefordshire and take its chance in a stranger's glasshouse. And on the last morning, the last day of September, with the year turning and the elms along the Compton road already dropping, she climbed up onto the Exeter mail where it changed horses at the Solars' gate, with 1 corded trunk, 1 bandbox, her fern book with the dead man's letter inside the cover, and the tin of Dorset ferns held upon her lap the whole 2 days, as though it were an infant. And she did not once look back at the parsonage, because she had learned long ago that looking back was a luxury for people who had somewhere to be sorry to leave. And a woman who has kept another man's house for her board leaves nothing behind her but the labor of her own 2 hands. The journey was long and cold and broken, north and west by ways she did not know, through Sherborne and Wincanton, and up over the wet green shoulder of Somerset. A night at a coaching inn at Bristol where she sat up in a hard chair rather than trust the sheets, and kept the tin of ferns on the window sill away from the fire. And then the second day over the Severn and up into a country that changed under her eyes as she watched, the land lifting and folding into red-earthed hills, the hedges growing high and shaggy and full of the last blackberries, orchards everywhere, the apples down in the wet grass, and the black and white houses leaning their timbers this way and that as though the whole county had been built by a carpenter who trusted his eye over his rule. She had never seen country so green so late in the year, nor so many small rivers, and when at last the Hereford coach set her down in the yard of the City Arms in the failing light of the second afternoon, stiff to the bone and gray with the dust of 200 miles, she stood a moment under the archway with the tin box in her arms, and understood, in the way that a thing is understood in the body before the mind will consent to it, that she was a very long way indeed from the parsonage of Nether Compton, and that whatever waited for her out along the Bodenham road was now, for good or ill, her own. Mr. Hetherington had sent a gig. It was waiting in the inn-yard with a steady old cob between the shafts and a manservant at the head who touched his hat to her and said, "Miss Musgrave, ma'am, from the Grange," and took her trunk without being asked, and she was grateful for it in a way that surprised her. That there should be a person in this unknown city who knew her name and had been sent on her account, for it was a very great while since anyone had been sent on her account. The solicitor himself came out from his chambers in St. Owen Street, bareheaded into the dusk to hand her up into the gig. A spare, upright man of 60 or thereabouts in plain black superfine with gold-rimmed spectacles and a dry, attentive face, and he begged her pardon that he would not come with her that evening, the light being nearly gone and the ford at Lugbridge uncertain after the rains. But he would wait upon her at the Grange the following forenoon, he said, with the papers, and in the meantime Mrs. Pendlebury had aired the house and would make her comfortable. And he hoped, he said, and here the dryness went out of his voice for a moment, and something else came into it. He hoped she would not judge the place by the first sight of it in the dark, for Mr. Merrick had cared a great deal more for the inside of his glasshouses than the outside of his gates, and there was work wanted. But it was, he said, and stopped, and then finished simply. It was a good house, ma'am, kept by a good man, and I am glad it has gone to somebody who wrote to me about the fire in the Fern house before she wrote to me about the £4,000. And Lavinia Musgrave, who had not known that the postscript about the fire had been read as anything at all, much less remembered, found she could not immediately answer him, and only pressed the tin box a little closer and said, when she had command of herself, "Is the fire still alight, Mr. Hetherington?" And he said, "It is, ma'am. Morning and evening, upon your instruction, Truan has seen to it." And she said, "Then I am content," and let the gig carry her out into the dark. It was full night, and a thin new moon, before the gig turned in between two stone gate piers with the caps fallen off them and lichen furring the ball finials, and went up a rutted sweep under trees that met overhead, and came out before a long low house that showed her, in the lantern light and the little moon, a black and white front much older than she had looked for, gabled and leaning and honest, with a stone-tiled roof gone golden gray with age and a great yew crowding one end, and the pale glimmer of glass away to the left where the ranges stood. There were lights in two of the lower windows. The door opened before the gig had stopped, throwing a long yellow bar across the wet gravel, and a woman came out onto the step with a candle sheltered in her hand, a spare, straight-backed woman of 60 in gray stuff, and a white apron and a widow's cap, with a bunch of keys at her waist, and a face that had done a great deal of grieving lately and meant not to show it. And this was Mrs. Pendlebury, who had kept Josiah Merrick's house for 31 years, and had washed and laid him out with her own hands in August, and had not known, from that day to this, whether the doing of it would leave her a home or turn her onto the parish, and who now stood on the step holding her candle steady, and looked at the plain, tired, gray with dust young woman climbing down from the gig with a tin box clutched to her breast as though it were the crown jewels, and dropped a curtsy and said, in a voice she had rehearsed a great many times that afternoon, and got out now almost without a tremor, "You're very welcome to Aldermere, ma'am." And Lavinia, standing in the wet with the whole strange weight of it upon her, looked not at the house nor at the woman, but at the pale ranges of glass off to the left, and said the first words she spoke upon her own land, which were, "Thank you, Mrs. Pendlebury. I am very glad to be come," and then, before ever she crossed the threshold, "Will you take me first to the Fern house?" There was a silence upon the step. The manservant stopped with the trunk half off the gig. Mrs. Pendlebury's candle did not waver, but her face did, all at once and beyond her governing, and she put up her free hand quickly to her mouth, and it was a moment before Lavinia understood that the old woman was not distressed, but undone, wholly undone, by the one thing in the world she had not looked to hear from the fine new owner up from the south to take her fortune, which was that the first place she wished to be taken, dusty and starved and stiff from 200 miles, was to the Ferns. He said, Mrs. Pendlebury got out at last and had to begin again. He always said whoever came after him would go to the house first and the fire second, if they went to the fire at all. And Lavinia said, then he did not know me, which was true, and no, she thought, but he knew my fourth sheet, which was truer. Mrs. Pendlebury took up a horn lantern from the hall table and lit it from her candle, and led the new mistress of Aldermere, on the very first night and before her trunk was fairly in the house, away round the dark bulk of the gable and along a flagged path slippery with wet leaves, past the cold pale fronts of 3 great glass houses where the vine leaves hung black against the little moon, to a 4th and smaller range built low against a warm brick wall, iron-framed and many-paned, with a squat brick chimney at its end, from which, even now, even at that hour, there rose a thin, steady breath of smoke, and she opened the door, and the warmth came out to meet them, damp and green and living, the smell of wet earth and moss and growing things in the cold northern night, and she lifted the lantern, and Lavinia Musgrave stepped into her cousin's fern house for the first time, and stood quite still. There were hundreds of them, ranked on staged slate benches, and hung in baskets and spilling from a raised bed of tufa in the center, and climbing the warm brick of the back wall. Heart's tongue and lady fern, and the black spleenwort, and the delicate maidenhair that no Herefordshire winter would suffer out of doors, and things she did not know, tender things. Tree ferns barely knee-high in tubs of peat, filmy ferns under bell glasses beaded with their own breath, the whole small warm room green from floor to glass and breathing in the lantern light 40 years of one man's looking gathered under one iron roof, and kept alive, morning and evening, by a fire that a steward had fed on the instruction of a woman he had never seen, because she had written to a lawyer about the frost before she wrote to him about the money. Lavinia set the tin box down upon the nearest bench, very gently, among the living crowns, and she did not say anything at all for a long time. And Mrs. Pendlebury, holding the lantern, watched the new mistress reach out one ink-stained finger and turn the underside of a hart's tongue frond to the light to count the sorry along the rib of the back of the leaf, the way a person counts to be sure of something, or to be sure of themselves, and the old housekeeper, who had feared the auctioneer and the primrose waistcoat and the cold end of 31 years, felt something in her chest that she had not felt since the 11th of August come loose and ease, and she said, softly into the green and breathing dark. "Welcome home, ma'am." And this time she meant the word she had rehearsed all afternoon, and this time it came out whole. She woke the next morning in a low-paneled chamber under the eaves, with the light coming green through a curtain of ivy across the casement, and for the space of a breath she did not know where she was, and reached, as she had reached every morning for 4 years, for the memory of what wanted doing in another man's house. And then she remembered that there was no other man's house, that the house was hers, and that somewhere below her the fire in the Fern house had been fed at first light by a man she had not yet met. And she lay still a moment, and let the strangeness of it settle over her like the green light through the ivy. And then she rose, because a house does not learn itself from a bed. Mr. Hetherington came at 11 as he had promised, driving out himself from Hereford, with a black tin box of papers upon the seat beside him, and he was closeted with her for 2 hours in the room that Mrs. Pendlebury called the South Library, a long, low, book-lined room that smelled of leather and dust and dead fires, and looked out through a broad sashed window down a grass slope to the gray gleam of the lug. He read her the will entire, in the flat music of the law, and then he read it again in plainer words, for the parts that touched her nearest. And he laid before her the particulars of the estate as they stood, which were better than she had feared, and more burdened than the dead man's letter had let her guess. There was the house and its grounds, and the 4 Glasshouses, and the Fern house. There were the 240 acres, of which 40 were the home closes kept in the estate's own hand, and near 100 were let to 2 tenants at rents that had not been raised in 20 years, and were the better part of them owing. There were the water meadows, valuable, and the mill, let at £42 and paid to the day by an honest miller. There were the greater and lesser woods, oak and ash, and a great deal of neglected coppice, which Mr. Merrick had loved for the ferns that grew in their damp bottoms, and had never once thought to fell for timber, so that there stood upon the estate, Mr. Hetherington said, with the nearest thing to feeling a solicitor permits himself, a matter of some hundreds of pounds of standing oak that a more provident owner would have turned into money years since, and a less scrupulous heir might turn into money now. And there was the £4,000 in the consols, which threw off £120 the year, and the household plate, and the folios, and the library, and the whole apparatus of a botanist's life, valued in the probate inventory, he said dryly, at £11 by an appraiser from Hereford who did not know a Linnaean herbarium from a bundle of last year's kale, and worth, to a man who did, more than the plate and the consols together. Lavinia listened to all of it very still, with her hands folded upon the writing table, and her gray eyes going to the window and the river and back. And when he had done, she asked him 3 questions, and Mr. Hetherington, who had expected either tears or triumph and got neither, marked all 3, and thought about them a long while afterward. She asked, first, whether the 2 tenants whose rents were in arrear were poor men or idle men, for she would deal very differently, she said, with the one than the other. She asked, second, whether the 2 gardeners who had kept Mr. Merrick's paths and fed his fires were provided for in the will, and when Miss Hetherington said that they were not named, that Mr. Merrick had trusted the matter of the servants to the good sense of whoever should come after him. She was silent a moment, and then said that they were not to be uneasy. Any of them, Mrs. Pendlebury, nor Trewin, nor the gardeners, that their places were safe as long as she had a roof to keep them under, and would he see that they were told so today, plainly, so that no one need lie awake over it another night. And she asked, third, whether there was in the county any person who might dispute her title. Mr. Hetherington took off his gold-rimmed spectacles at that, and polished them with a square of silk, and put them on again, which she came to know later was the thing he did when he was choosing his words with particular care, and he said, "Ma'am, there is a gentleman. His name is Sir Goderic Fawkes. He is a baronet of an old but much encumbered family, whose land marches with the greater wood along the western boundary, and who is, by a descent I will not weary you with this morning, a connection of the late Mr. Merrick's upon the paternal side, being the grandson of Mr. Merrick's father's younger brother, and therefore, until you were found, the nearest male relation living, and the person who confidently expected, these 10 years and more, to inherit Aldermere. He has inquired after Mr. Merrick's health with great regularity. He called upon me twice in August. He was not, I may tell you, ma'am, gratified to learn of the existence of a cousin's daughter in Dorset, and I should be doing you a poor service if I let you suppose that we have heard the last of him. I do not think he has any case in law, but a man with an old name and a new want of money, and a barrister in Hereford who is paid to be hopeful, can put an heiress to a great deal of trouble and expense before the law is done with him. And it is my duty to tell you so. And my advice, he said, and here he looked at her over the spectacles. My advice, ma'am, is that you should not be frightened by him, and should not be hurried by him, and should refer him, on every occasion and in every particular, to me. Lavinia turned this over, and looked out at the river, and said at last, "Is he the primrose waistcoat?" And Mr. Hetherington, startled, said, "Ma'am," and she said, "My cousin's letter spoke of a gentleman in Hereford who had these 10 years inquired after his health with the tenderness of a heron watching a pool, and Mr. Hetherington, who had known Josiah Merrick for 30 years and buried him in August and had not, he realized, laughed then, once dryly, and said, 'That is the man, ma'am, to the life. The heron is very good, and I see that you are your cousin's kinswoman in more than the drawing of Ferns.' That afternoon Mr. Trewin took her over the estate. He was a broad, weather-dark, deliberate man of 50, the steward, plain in his speech and slow to give his liking, but not, she thought, slow to give it truly once it was given. And he had loved the old master in the undemonstrative way of a man who had worked 40 years alongside another, and never once called him friend to his face. And he watched the new mistress narrowly all that first afternoon to learn what manner of creature the law had set over him. He learned a good deal. He learned that she walked the wet coppice bottoms in stout boots without complaint, and stopped, unbidden, over a clump of the royal fern in a marshy hollow, and told him its name in the Latin and the English both, and the reason it grew there and nowhere else upon the acre. He learned that, when he showed her the standing oak in the greater wood and said, half testing, that a Hereford timber merchant had already sent to ask would the new owner sell, and there was £300 in it and more. She looked a long while up into the grey branches and then said, "Not this year, Mr. Trewin, and perhaps not in my time, for a man does not fell in a season what took 100 years to grow, unless his children are hungry, and mine are not, having none. But mark me the trees that are past their prime and crowding the young ones, and we will take those and no others, and put the money to the tenants' cottages, which I am told want roofs." And Mr. Trewin, who had braced himself all afternoon for the auctioneer and the primrose waistcoat and the felling axe, took off his hat at the edge of the greater wood, ostensibly to wipe his brow, though the October air was cold, and put it on again, and said, "Very well, ma'am," and said almost nothing else the whole way home, and went into his own cottage that evening and said to his wife, over his supper, that the young woman up from Dorset had looked at the master's oaks the way the master used to look at them, and that he did not think, after all, that they were sold. It was into this first settling, in the second week, before Lavinia had so much as learned the names of the home fields, that Sir Goderic Falkis made his opening move, and he made it, as Mr. Hetherington had foretold, not with violence, but with paper, and with the elaborate, wounded courtesy of a man who means to have a thing, and wishes it to be understood that the law, in giving it to another, has committed an oversight that gentlemen will shortly correct. There came first his card, left by a groom, a large and handsome card engraved with the Falk's arms and a great deal of Latin motto, and upon the back of it, in a florid hand, the message that Sir Goderic Falkis presented his compliments to the lady lately arrived at Aldermere, condoled with her upon the melancholy occasion that had brought her among them, and would do himself the honor of waiting upon her upon the following Thursday, upon a matter, he wrote, of family concern which he was persuaded a lady of sense would prefer to settle between relations rather than to submit to the cold and expensive offices of the law. And Lavinia, reading it in the green light of the fern house with a watering can in her other hand, understood every word of it and the shape of the thing behind the words, and she finished watering the maidenhair before she went in to write her reply, which was civil and brief, and stated that she would be happy to receive Sir Goderic on Thursday, and that she had asked her solicitor, Mr. Hetherington, to be present at the interview, as she made it her practice to attend to all matters of family concern and of law in his company, and none of them without him. She sent the note by the returning groom. And then she went back to the fern house, and moved the tin of Dorset Hart's tongue out of its box at last, and into a bed of its own upon the staged bench, among her cousin's ferns, where it belonged, and pressed the soil about the 3 young crowns with her ink-stained fingers, and said to them, under her breath, in the warm green quiet, well, we are none of us to be got out of here so easily as that, and if he thinks a card with a Latin motto will do it, he did not know my cousin, and he does not yet know me. Sir Goderic Falkis came on the Thursday at noon, in a barouche too grand for the Bodenham lanes and splashed to the axle with the mud of them, and he came, Lavinia observed from the south library window as he was handed down, a large, high-colored, well-fed gentleman of 45 in a claret coat, and a waistcoat of primrose silk figured with small gold sprigs, with a heavy gold quizzing glass on a ribbon and rings upon 2 fingers of each hand, and a way of looking up at the front of the house as he came. That was the look of a man pricing a thing he considers already his own, and finding it in poorer repair than he had hoped. Mr. Hetherington had come out from Hereford an hour before, and was established at the writing table with his black tin box and a fresh-cut pen. Mrs. Pendlebury showed the visitor in with a face like a closed door, and Sir Goderic Falkis swept into the low book-lined room where the last owner of it had spent 40 years, and bowed over Lavinia's hand a little longer than was needful, and told her at once and at length how very deeply he felt for her in her bereavement, how melancholy it was that she should have made the acquaintance of her Herefordshire relations only across a grave, how he had loved poor Josiah, poor dear eccentric Josiah, as an elder brother, had ridden over to Aldermere, I cannot tell you how often these 10 years, to see that the old man wanted for nothing in his solitude, and how it grieved him, it positively grieved him, that a lady of Miss Musgrave's evident refinement should find herself burdened, quite alone and unprotected, with the management of an estate so sadly encumbered, so fallen out of heart, so wholly, he might almost say, beyond the strength of any woman to set right. Lavinia thanked him for his condolences, and begged him to sit, and rang for Mrs. Pendlebury to bring wine, and said nothing at all to the rest of it, and let the silence do its work, which was a thing she had learned in 4 years of a house where no one ever asked her opinion, that a silence held long enough will draw a talking man further out onto the ice than any question could. Sir Goderic went out onto the ice. He came, by graceful stages, over a glass of the dead man's Madeira to the matter of family concern. It was a delicate thing, he said, a very delicate thing, and he would not for the world distress her. But she must understand that poor Josiah had not always been, in his latter and more solitary years, entirely, how should he put it, entirely the master of his affairs, that there had been within the family for many years a settled understanding, an understanding amounting very nearly to a promise that Aldermere, which had come to Josiah from their common grandfather, should upon Josiah's death without issue return, as was only right, as was only natural, as the old grandfather had always intended, to the male line, to himself, to Sir Goderic, who bore the blood and the name, and whose own poor acres marched with the very wood, and that this understanding had been, he had every reason to believe, embodied at one time in a formal settlement, a deed, drawn up he could not say precisely when, but certainly within his grandfather's lifetime, which settlement, could it but be found, would show beyond the possibility of dispute that the late will, made by a sick and solitary old man under influences he would not name, but might be guessed at, was so much waste paper, and Aldermere his own. He did not wish to go to law. Law was so very cold, so very expensive, so very public. He wished, as one relation to another, to spare Miss Musgrave the pain and the ruin of a contest she could not, he was grieved to say, hope to win, by proposing that she should quietly withdraw her claim, retire with a suitable provision. A genteel annuity he would himself see settled upon her, of, he thought, £80 the year, which for a single lady of modest habits was surely handsome, and leave Aldermere to the hands and the name to which nature and the old grandfather had always meant it to descend. There, it was said. He leaned back in the dead man's chair and turned his quizzing glass and looked at her with the confidence of a man who has offered a drowning woman a rope and expects her gratitude. Lavinia let the silence run a moment more. Then she said, very evenly, Sir Goderic, you speak of a settlement, a deed, drawn up in your grandfather's lifetime that would divert this estate from the will. Have you seen this deed? He had not, of course, seen it. It had been mislaid. These things were so often mislaid. But he had every reason, the strongest reason, family tradition, his late father's own frequent assurance. You have not seen it, she said again, not sharply, only closing the door of the sentence. And you cannot produce it. It is not in your hands, nor your solicitor's hands, nor deposited at any office that you can name. Sir Goderic said that its absence was precisely the melancholy circumstance he had come to lament, and that its absence in no way disproved its existence, and that a court of equity, moved by the manifest justice of his claim and the manifest oddity of poor Josiah's later conduct, might presume, said Mr. Hetherington from the writing-table, dryly, without looking up from the note he was making, is not a phrase, Sir Goderic, upon which I should care to advise a client to surrender 240 acres. And Lavinia said before the baronet could color, Sir Goderic, I am going to be very plain with you, because you have been at great pains to be delicate with me, and I find that delicacy, prolonged, becomes a kind of noise. You have offered me £80 a year to give you an estate worth, as I am advised, above 400 a year clear when its rents are set to rights, together with a house and a library and 4 glass houses and a fern house, on the strength of a deed that you have never seen, cannot produce, and describe only from your father's frequent assurance. I have, in this room, the will of Josiah Merrick, proved in the proper court, naming me his sole devicee, and setting out in his own words, in a letter that lies under the cover of a book not 10 feet from where you sit, his particular reasons for the gift. If you have a deed, Sir Goderic, bring it. Bring it to Mr. Hetherington, who will examine it with the greatest willingness, for it is his business to see that a good title is a sound one, and neither he nor I have anything to fear from any true paper in the world. But do not come to me again with a deed made of family tradition and your late father's assurance, and the hope of what a court might presume, and offer me, in the character of a benefactor, an annuity out of my own land, and expect me to be grateful for the rope while you tell me I am drowning. I am not drowning, Sir Goderic. I am at home. It was said without heat, in the even, unhurried voice that made strangers think her cold, and it landed in the low room like a stone into the fish stew, and for a moment Sir Goderic Fawkes could not find his feet upon the ice at all. Then the high color came up over his stock, and the benevolence went out of his large face and showed her, for the length of a breath, the thing that lived beneath it, which was not grief for poor dear Josiah at all, but the flat, affronted greed of a man who has counted on a thing for 10 years and been robbed of it, as he saw it, by a chit of a Dorset spinster with ink on her fingers. And he rose and gathered his claret coat about him, and said, with the venom now barely under the courtesy, that he was sorry, very sorry, to find Miss Musgrave so ill-advised, so very ill-advised, that he had come in the spirit of family and been answered in the spirit of the attorney, that she would find the law a colder friend than the cousin she had refused, and that she would hear from Mr. Pinda, his man in Hereford, within the week. And as he said it, drawing on his gloves in his heat, his eye fell, as a man's eye will fall in a strange room when he is casting for something to be lofty about, upon the great framed watercolor of a fern that hung in the place of honor above the south library chimney-piece, the drawing Josiah Merrick had bought at a shilling and framed in gilt and hung where other men hang their fathers. And Sir Goderic, wanting to wound and reaching for the nearest thing, said, with a curl of his lip, "And I see the old fool has left you his rubbish as well as his acres. A weed in a gilt frame, it is of a piece with the whole sad business." Lavinia rose too then, and she went and stood before the drawing, and she looked at it, the heart's tongue on the 4th sheet, her own drawing, done at the parsonage of Nethercompton 3 winters gone for the roof of a charity school, hung here in gilt above a dead man's hearth in a county she had never seen, and she turned back to Sir Goderic Fawkes with the stillness come down over her grey eyes like ice over the lug, and she said, "That weed, Sir Goderic, is a heart's tongue fern, Scolopendrium vulgar, and it was drawn by me, and your cousin Josiah Merrick, whom you loved as a brother and rode over so often to comfort in his solitude, bought it 3 years ago from a print seller in Ludgate at a shilling the sheet, and hung it there, and never in his life knew that I existed until he had counted the sorry on the back of that leaf and found them true. That is why Aldermere is mine and not yours, not because a sick old man was worked upon, because he looked all his life at the thing itself, and so, it seems, do I. And he knew his own when he saw it at a shilling the sheet, which is a thing, Sir Goderic, that you have proven in this last half hour you would not know how to do if it hung, as it does, in a gilt frame above your head. Good morning." And Sir Goderic Fawkes, who had come to buy her out for £80 and stayed to be instructed in botany by a spinster before his own solicitor's arrival, went out of the South Library with his colour very high and his Latin motto much diminished, and was heard by Mrs. Pendlebury in the passage to say a word that was not in any motto at all, and drove away in his mud-splashed barouche down the Bodenham road at a pace that did the dead man's gravel no good and his own temper less. Mr. Pinda's letter came, as promised, within the week, and it was a long, learned, and unhappy document, for Mr. Pinda was an honest barrister, obliged to make the best of a poor brief, and the strain of it showed in every hedged clause. It gave notice that Sir Goderic Fawkes intended to contest the will of Josiah Merrick, deceased, upon the grounds, first, of an alleged family settlement made in the time of the common grandfather, one Ambrose Merrick, whereby the estate of Aldermere was said to have been limited to the heirs male of the body, and, second, of the alleged incapacity and undue influence under which the late will was said to have been procured. It demanded the production of divers papers. It threatened a bill in Chancery. And it closed with the customary expression of a hope that the matter might yet be compromised without recourse to the court, which both Mr. Hetherington and Lavinia read, correctly, as the sound of a man who did not himself believe in his own bill and was praying his adversary might be frightened into buying him off. Lavinia was not frightened. She sat with Mr. Hetherington over the letter in the South Library through a long grey afternoon, and she asked him to teach her, plainly and without sparing her, exactly where she stood. For she would not, she said, be defended in a matter that touched her own house as though she were a child to be kept out of the room while the men talked. And Mr. Hetherington, who had never in 33 years been asked by a client to be taught the law rather than merely comforted by it, found himself explaining to her, over the course of that afternoon and two more, the whole architecture of the thing, that the burden of proving the settlement lay wholly upon Sir Goderic, that a settlement not produced and not registered and remembered only by family tradition was in law scarcely a shadow, that the charge of incapacity must be proved by those who made it and could be met, and would be crushed, by the testimony of the very persons who had known Josiah Merrick at the last, of Mr. Hetherington himself, who had taken the will from the old man's own clear instructions in the spring, of Dr. Wells the physician, of the curate, Mr. Bramwell, who had sat with him and read to him, and found him to the end as sharp in his wits as any man in Herefordshire, and a great deal sharper than most, and of Mrs. Pendlebury, who had kept his house 31 years and would tell any court in England that her master had known his own mind on the 11th of August better than the men now questioning it knew theirs. And Lavinia, learning all this, saw that Sir Goderic's whole case rested upon a document that did not exist, and a slander upon a dead man that the living would not suffer. And she said to Mr. Hetherington, then he has nothing, and Mr. Hetherington said, in law, ma'am, he has very nearly nothing, but nothing. Pressed by a determined man through the Court of Chancery, can cost a defendant 2 years and £1,000 before it is proved to be nothing. And that, ma'am, and not any hope of winning, is the whole of his engine. He means to make the winning cost you more than the losing, and to sit at Fawkes across the boundary wall and wait for a lone woman to tire. Then, said Lavinia, we must see that it costs him more than it costs me, and that I do not tire. And she asked Mr. Hetherington what a determined defendant did, and he told her, and she did it. She did not wait to be sued. Upon Mr. Hetherington's advice she moved first. She caused a thorough search to be made, at the several registries and among the papers of the old attorney who had served the grandfather Ambrose Merrick, for the very settlement Sir Goderic pretended, so that its absence might be established not by her word, but by the sworn certificate of every office that ought to have held it, and did not. And the searches came back empty, one after another, each empty return a nail in the coffin of the imagined deed. She caused Mr. Bramwell and Dr. Wells and Mr. Hetherington to set down, while memory was fresh, their accounts of Josiah Merrick's clear understanding in his last spring, sworn and witnessed. A wall of honest testimony built before the enemy had brought up his guns, and she did one thing more, which was her own thought and not the lawyer's, and which won the business in the end more surely than any registry return. She invited Mr. Penda to Aldermere. Not Sir Goderic, Mr. Penda, the barrister, the honest man tied to the poor brief. She wrote to him herself, civilly, and said that she understood he was to examine the papers of the estate, and that rather than compel him to it by an order of the court, she would be happy to lay every paper of her cousin's open to him at the Grange, at his convenience, and to answer upon her honor any question he might put. For she had, she wrote, nothing whatever to conceal, and it seemed to her a folly that 2 counties' worth of lawyers' fees should be spent to establish what an afternoon's honest looking would settle. Mr. Penda, much struck, for it is not the common practice of a defendant to fling open her muniment room to the plaintiff's counsel, came. He spent a long day in the South Library with the black tin box and the old estate papers and Mr. Hetherington at his elbow, and Lavinia brought him tea with her own hands and left him to it. And by the end of that day the honest barrister had satisfied himself of 3 things: that there was no settlement and never had been, that the will was as sound a will as was ever proved in the diocese, and that the lady who owned Aldermere was neither the scheming adventuress nor the helpless spinster his client had by turns described to him, but a clear-headed, exact, an entirely creditable woman who had offered him the truth across her own table when she might have made him fight 2 years for the sight of it. He went back to Hereford, and he did the thing an honest barrister does when he has found his brief to be false. He told his client so plainly that there was no case, that the bill in Chancery would fail, and fail with costs, and that if Sir Goderic pressed it against his advice he must seek other counsel, for he, Penda, would not lend his name to the harassing of a lawful owner upon a claim he now knew to be groundless. And Sir Goderic Fawkes, deprived at a stroke of his barrister, his imagined deed, and his hope of frightening a lone woman into a compromise, stood at the last upon nothing at all and knew it, and did what such men do, which was to let the threatened suit die quietly and unmentioned, as though it had never been made, and to tell the county, at such dinners as would still have him, that he had graciously forborne to distress his poor cousin with a contest, family feeling having in the end prevailed over his undoubted rights. Nobody in the county believed him. The story of the interview in the South Library had got about, as such stories will, carried out of the passage by Mrs. Pendlebury's silence and Mr. Truan's single dry sentence at the smithy, that the new mistress had told Sir Goderic to his face what a hart's tongue was, and whose land he stood on, and it was repeated at every farm and forge from Bodenham to Hereford, with great and growing relish, so that within a month Lavinia Musgrave, who had meant only to defend her cousin's house, found that she had without trying become a small legend in her own valley. The Dorset lady who was not to be got out of Aldermere by a card with a Latin motto, who kept the old master's ferns alight through the winter, who would not sell the oaks, and who had sent the Primrose baronet home to Fawkes across the boundary wall with his motto, as the smith put it, took down a peg and hung up wet. With the shadow of Sir Goderic lifted, the winter closed in over Aldermere, and Lavinia Musgrave set herself to the 2 things that a house and its people needed of her, which were that they should be warm, and that they should be known. She went to church on the first Sunday and every Sunday after, walking down through the wet home close to the little grey church of St. Michael that stood among its yews at the bottom of the parish, with the lug running behind it, and she took the Aldermere pew, that had stood empty through the years of Josiah Merrick's retirement. For the old man had loved his Maker chiefly out of doors, and had not troubled the church above 3 times a year. And the parish, which had come that first Sunday very largely to look at her, looked and saw a plainly dressed woman in half mourning, who sang the psalms in a low true voice, and stayed to speak to the poorest of them in the porch afterward, and asked the sexton the names of the ferns on the north wall of the tower as though it mattered, and went home again on her own 2 feet through the mud, and the parish made up its slow country mind about her, as parishes do, and having made it up did not afterward change it. The curate was a Mr. Bramwell, a lean, mild, book-loving man of 40, in a coat gone green at the seams, who served the parish for a stipend that a Hereford tradesman would have scorned, and was the happier of the 2, and who had been, in the last solitary years, very nearly Josiah Merrick's only friend, having been the one man in the county who could sit with the old botanist of an evening and talk of Linnaeus and of Mr. Ray's synopsis, and not think him mad. He called at the Grange in the 2nd week of her church-going, shy and awkward and clutching a book, and stayed 3 hours, and went away having found in the new mistress a person who not only suffered his enthusiasms, but returned them with interest and correction, and he came back the next week and the week after, and became by Christmas a fixed part of the small life of the house. The man who walked the winter coppices with her naming the ferns under the snow, who recommended her books and borrowed hers, and who said to his sister, with whom he lodged, that Providence, which had taken away the one friend of his mind in the county, had with an unusual delicacy sent another before the grave was well grassed over, and a woman at that, which he had not looked for, and did not. He found it all mind. And there came into the house that winter too, a companion for her, for Mrs. Pendlebury, said plainly one December morning that it was not fitting nor healthful for the mistress to sit alone every evening in that great cold library with only the ferns for company, and that she had a niece, her dead sister's girl, a Miss Tabitha Coyne, 23, orphaned, poor, and sweet-tempered, at present a burden to relations who could ill afford her over Ludlow Way, who could read aloud and keep accounts and had a pretty hand, and would ask no wage beyond her keep and be grateful past telling for a home, and Lavinia, who knew to the bone what it was to be 23 and orphaned, and a burden to relations who could ill afford one, sent for Tabitha Coyne within the week, and found her all her aunt had promised, a soft, round, cheerful, biddable girl, with none of the mistress's gift for the thing itself, but a great warm capacity for loving the people about her, and the 2 of them suited from the first evening. And if Aldermere had been a house of one woman's exactness before, it became that winter a house of 2 women's, the one all clear cool-looking, and the other all warmth, and was the better balanced for it, and Miss Tabitha read Cowper aloud by the library fire while the mistress mounted her ferns, and the long evenings that Mrs. Pendlebury had feared were not lonely at all. To the tenants and the estate Lavinia brought the same clear-looking she brought to a frond. She had asked Mr. Trewin, that first week, whether the men whose rents were owing were poor or idle, and she had gone herself through the December mud to see, and she found the one, a widower with 5 children in a cottage whose roof let in the sky over 2 of the beds, poor past any owing of rent, and the other, a snug and grumbling man with a good farm and a bad habit of paying his betters, last merely idle, and she dealt with the 2 as she had promised very differently. To the idle man she sent Mr. Trewin with a plain message that the rent would be paid at Lady Day or the farm roulette, and it was paid. To the widower she went herself, and looked at the roof, and looked at the children, and forgave him the whole arrear on the spot in exchange, she said, for his help the following autumn with the coppicing, so that it should be a bargain and not a charity, and he need not feel it, And then she gave order to Mr. Trewin that the oaks marked as past their prime in the greater wood should be felled that winter after all, not for the timber merchant's 300 pounds into her own pocket, but that the money should go, every shilling of it, upon new roofs and sound floors for the 3 estate cottages that wanted them, beginning with the widowers. And when Mr. Trewin, who approved but was careful, observed that it was a great deal to lay out in a first winter, upon houses that brought in but a few pounds a year, she said, "Mr. Trewin, my cousin kept these people under a whole roof for 40 years and asked their rents but seldom, and raised them never, and I do not think he did it because it paid. I think he did it because a man who has looked all his life at the true undersides of leaves cannot help, in the end, seeing the true state of his neighbors' roofs, and being unable to look away, and I am his cousin, and I find I cannot look away either, roof the cottages." And Mr. Trewin roofed the cottages. She went, too, before the winter was out, into the parish school, a cold, ill-found single room by the church where 30 children of the poor learned their letters 3 days in the week from a worn-out old dame paid in eggs and pence, and she found the dame kindly and past her work, and the children eager and half-frozen, and she began to go down of a Thursday afternoon, at first only to bring wood for the school fire, and then to hear the little ones there reading, and then, because she could no more help it than she could help counting sorry, to bring down her fern book and show them, on the wet slates and the churchyard walls of their own parish, the green things that grew about them unregarded, the hart's tongue and the polypody and the wall-rue, and to set the quickest of them to finding and pressing and naming until there was got up, quite without her intending any such thing, a small society of Bodenham children who could tell a lady fern from a male fern at 40 paces, and were prouder of it than of anything they owned. And the old dame said she had never seen the dull ones brighten so. And Mr. Bramwell said from the pulpit, in a sermon upon the lilies of the field that everyone understood, that it was a great and a Christian thing to teach the poor to see the wealth that God had strewn for nothing along their own lanes, and the mothers of the parish, who had begun by mistrusting a mistress who grubbed in ditches like a girl, ended by sending word up to the Grange when a strange fern showed in a well shaft or a quarry, so that the whole valley became, that first winter and spring, a kind of scattered outdoor room of the fern house, all of it looking, now, at the thing itself, because the lady up at Aldermere had shown them how. It was in the deep of that first winter, in January, when the fern house was safe, and the cottages roofed and the baronet gone quiet across his wall, that Lavinia turned at last to the thing she had left until she should have leisure to do it rightly, which was the ordering of her cousin's folios. They filled the whole of the north wall of the south library, 40 years of them, great flat portfolios tied with faded tape and stacked in a press, the pressed and mounted collections of a lifetime, and no man living but Josiah Merrick had known their order, and he had died in August with the knowledge in his head. She began at the beginning, meaning only to catalogue, and she was a fortnight at it, Miss Tabitha holding the sheets and reading out the dates while the mistress named and numbered, and it was slow, grave, happy work, for it was like being led through the whole long looking of a life by the man who had done the looking, county by county and year by year, his hand growing surer through the 1780s and firmer still through the 1790s, and then, at the last, in the second decade of the new century, spidery again as the letter had been. And folded in among the sheets, as such things are, there were papers, a note of where a plant was got, a fragment of a letter from a fellow botanist, a bill from the Dutchman who made the iron of the fern house, the small silt of a life caught between the leaves. But in the oldest portfolio of all, the first, the one whose sheets were dated in the 1770s when Josiah Merrick had been a young man and Aldermere knew come to him from the grandfather, Lavinia found, pressed flat and brown, with age between two sheets of an early hart's tongue, a single frond of the same fern, very old, the mounting paper foxed and soft, and upon the paper, in a round girlish hand that was not her cousin's, 2 words and a date, for Josiah, and the year 1774. She sat a long while with that sheet. And then, because the hand teased at her, she fetched from the cover of her own fern book the letter Josiah Merrick had written her from beyond the grave, and she laid the two together, the girlish for Josiah of 1774 and the spidery your affectionate cousin of the last winter, and she could not make them the same hand. Of course, the one a girl's and the other a dying man's, but the trick of the tail on the Y, the particular loop of it, was in both. A family trick, a thing taught at one table to 2 children long ago, and she understood. Sitting there in the January cold with the 2 papers in her lap, that the girl who had pressed a hart's tongue for Josiah in 1774 had been of his own blood and his own childhood, and that the fern had been kept 40 years in the first portfolio next his heart, and she went to Mrs. Pendlebury. Mrs. Pendlebury told her what she knew, which was not all of it, but enough. There had been a sister. Josiah Merrick had had one sister, older than himself, a Miss Honoria Merrick, and the 2 of them, orphaned young, had been reared together at Aldermere under the grandfather Ambrose, and had been, by every account that came down, inseparable as children. The 2 of them forever out in the coppices with a tin box. The boy and the girl, both mad after the ferns. The 2 green-fingered Merricks the county had laughed at even then. And then the sister had grown up and done the thing that the grandfather Ambrose, a hard, proud, land-proud old man, could not forgive. She had married for love, and beneath her, a poor curate with nothing but his cloth and his kindness against the old man's flat command, and had been cast out for it, struck from the family and the will and the very speaking of her name, and had gone away south with her curate to Dorset, Mrs. Pendlebury believed, or Devon, one of the western counties, and had never come back, and had died, it was said, young, of a low fever, in a country parsonage, leaving the curate a widower with an infant girl, and old Ambrose Merrick had died unforgiving, and left the whole estate to the boy Josiah, who had grieved for his sister all his life in the silent way of his kind, and never spoken of her, and never, so far as Mrs. Pendlebury in 31 years had heard, gone to look for the child. Lavinia sat with this in the cold library, and it came together in her hands slowly, the way a drawing comes, line by line, until the thing itself stands plain upon the sheet. Honoria Merrick, cast out for marrying a poor curate, gone south into Dorset, dead young of a low fever, leaving a curate widower and an infant daughter. Her own mother had died when Lavinia was 2 years old of a fever, and her father, the Reverend Musgrave, a poor curate, had reared her alone and told her almost nothing of her mother, whose people, he said once and only once, had been gentlefolk who had wanted nothing to do with a clergyman's wife or a clergyman's child, and among the few things of her mother's that Lavinia owned, kept these many years at the bottom of the corded trunk, wrapped in a handkerchief, there was a little old book of pressed ferns, a girl's book, unsigned, that she had loved as a child before ever she could name what was in it, and had supposed all her life to be the reason the love of the green things was in her at all, come down she knew not how. She went up to her chamber under the eaves and fetched it down, the little unsigned book from the bottom of the trunk, and she laid it on the library table beside Josiah Merrick's first portfolio, and she opened the 2 together, and the hand that had pressed and named the Ferns in her mother's girlhood book was the round, girlish hand of the 4 Josiah of 1774. The same loop upon the tail of the Y, the same eye for the true underside of the leaf. And Lavinia Musgrave understood, at last, wholly, in the cold and the candlelight, with Miss Tabitha gone up to bed and the fire fallen to embers, why a solitary old botanist in Herefordshire, seeing a folio of fern drawings signed L.M., and offered at $1 the sheet for a Dorset charity school, had bought the whole and hung the 4th sheet in gilt above his hearth, and set himself in his last winter to find the lady who drew it. He had not left Aldermere to a stranger. He had known, somehow, from the drawings, from the county, from the initials, from the heart's tongue drawn truer than any hand in England, he had known his cast-out sister's granddaughter when he saw her work at $1 the sheet, the green thing surfacing again in the 3rd generation, where the hard old grandfather had thought to root it out forever. And he had spent his last strength not in righting an old wrong with money, which he might have done and did not, but in the one restitution that meant anything to a Merrick, which was to bring the sister's blood home to the coppices and the fern house and the true undersides of the leaves, and to leave in a girl's hand of 1774. Pressed 40 years next his heart in the first portfolio, the only proof he ever meant her to find of why. Lavinia wept then, which she had not done over the letter nor the will nor the whole strange fortune, sitting alone in the South Library with her mother's book open beside her great-uncle's, weeping not for grief, but for the long reach of it, the dead grandfather's hardness, and the dead sister's exile, and the dead brother's 40 years of silent, grieving all of it undone, and made whole at last in the counting of the sorry on the back of a leaf. And when she had done, she dried her eyes and took up her pen. And she did the thing her cousin had done for her, and would have understood. She mounted her mother's little girlhood book of ferns and Josiah's first portfolio together, and she set the pressed heart's tongue of 1774 at the head of them, and she began a folio of her own to follow after his, the 4th generation of the Green Merricks, so that whoever should come to Aldermere after her, in whatever far year, should be able to take down the portfolios from the north wall and read the whole long looking of the family entire, the girl and the boy in the coppices, the exile and the silence and the $1 folio, and the bringing home, all of it kept whole. In the fashion, she thought, her own true mother had kept it all her 2 short days, and her great-uncle after her, and now she. The spring came late that year, and then, all at once, as it does in the western counties, the lug meadows going from brown to a green that hurt the eye in the space of a fortnight, the orchards along the Bodenham road breaking into a foam of blossom, the coppice bottoms unrolling their fiddleheads in their thousands where Lavinia had walked them bare all winter, and with the spring the whole labor of Aldermere, which had gone to sleep neglected under the last owner's failing years, woke under the new mistress's hand. She had spent the winter learning the estate, she spent the spring mending it. The 3 great glass houses that Josiah Merrick had let fall out of heart, the vinery and the peach house and the great stove, were reglazed pane by pane, and their flues swept and their broken staging made good, not at a rush and not altogether, for she would not spend what she had not got, but steadily, one range brought back into bearing before the next was begun, so that by midsummer there were grapes setting again on the old vines that had borne nothing for 5 years, and a succession of pines coming on in the stove that Mrs. Pendlebury could not look at without shaking her head over the wonder of it. The neglected coppice was put back upon its rotation, cut and stored, and the marked oaks felled and drawn out by the widower's team, and the money of them laid out to the last shilling upon the cottage roofs, so that by May there was not a family upon the estate that slept under the sky, and the idle tenant, seeing which way the wind had set, paid his rent at Lady Day without being twice asked, and touched his hat to her afterward in the church porch, with a new respect that had a good deal of self-interest in it, and a little, she thought, of something better. And the fern house, which had been kept alive all winter, was made in the spring not merely to live but to flourish. The tender exotics that Josiah had gathered and half neglected were repotted and divided under her exact hands. The tree ferns given fresh peat, the filmy ferns their bell glasses cleaned, the whole small green room brought to a pitch of health it had not known in a decade, and Lavinia added to it, out of the coppices and the county and the parcels that began to come to her by carrier once her name got about among the botanists, until Aldermere's fern house was spoken of, that summer, in circles a good way beyond Herefordshire, as one of the 2 or 3 collections of note in the west of England, and men of science began to write to the lady who kept it, and 1 or 2 to ask, very civilly, whether they might be permitted to see it. It was her ferns, in the end, and not any design of the county's matchmaking mothers, who had by now quite given her up as a confirmed and eccentric spinster, that brought her into the way of the Duke. There was got up that June, for the benefit of the county infirmary at Hereford, a great horticultural exhibition and 50 in the grounds of a gentleman's seat near the city, the first the county had held, and Mr. Bramwell, who sat upon the committee of it in his mild, persistent way, would not rest until he had persuaded Lavinia to send some of her ferns to be shown, arguing that the credit of the parish and the good of the infirmary alike required it, and that it was a poor sort of humility that hid a light under a bushel when the light might raise £5 for the sick poor. She let herself be persuaded, and she sent, and she went, and her ferns, staged in a cool corner of the great marquee among the roses and the forced fruit and the prize gooseberries, drew to her discomfort a good deal more notice than she had looked for there was nothing else like them in the show. And the county, which knew a gooseberry when it saw one but had never in its life been asked to admire a fern, crowded about the strange green things and read the neat Latin cards in the lady's own hand and asked one another who had grown them, and was told the Dorset lady from Aldermere, her that saw off Sir Goderic, and looked at her sideways with the particular interest a county reserves for a woman who has beaten a man at his own game. And it was there, in the cool fern corner of the marquee, in the press and the heat of the June afternoon, that a gentleman came and stood a long while before her staged collection, alone, saying nothing, not reading the cards for the names as the others did, but looking at the plants themselves, turning up the underside of a hart's tongue frond with one careful finger to see the sorry on the back of the leaf, and then bending to a filmy fern under its bell glass and studying it as though the rest of the 50, the band and the crowd and the prize gooseberries, had ceased entirely to exist, and Lavinia, watching him from a little way off, knew him for one of her own kind before ever she learned his name. For there are perhaps not 50 people in England who will turn a fern to count the sorry when there is a band playing, and she had met in 29 years exactly one of them, and he was dead and had left her his house. The gentleman was perhaps 45, tall, spare, grave, plainly and even soberly dressed for so grand an occasion in a dark coat of no particular fashion, with gray coming at the temples of dark hair, and a long, quiet, attentive scholar's face, much weathered by out-of-door living, and hands, she noticed, that were a gardener's hands as much as a gentleman's, brown and capable. And when at last he straightened from the filmy fern and turned and found the lady of the collection standing near, and bowed, and asked her, gravely, without any of the flourish of the 50 about him, whether he might know the name of the trichomanes under the third bell glass, for he had tried it these 3 years in his own stove at home, and never kept it above a season. Lavinia told him its name, and where it grew, and why it died in most men's stoves and lived in hers, which was a matter of the water and the shade and the letting alone. And the grave gentleman listened to her as no one at that 50 had listened to anyone, with his whole still attention, and asked her 2 more questions, each of them the exact question a man asks who has himself failed at the thing and thought about why. And they stood in the cool green corner and talked of the culture of filmy ferns for the better part of a quarter of an hour, entirely at their ease and entirely forgetful of the crowd, before ever either of them thought to ask the other's name. And when the gentleman did at last recollect himself, and beg her pardon, and say that he had suffered his interest to run away with his manners, and had not so much as told her whom she was so good as to instruct, and gave his name, Lavinia found that the grave, plain, fern-turning gentleman who kept a stove of his own and could not keep his trichomanes alive was the 5th Duke of Wexbury, whose great house lay some 15 miles off across the county, and who was, she learned afterward from an astonished Mr. Bramwell, not only the first man in that part of England, but a fellow of the Linnean Society these 20 years. A serious botanist of a serious reputation, a widower long since and childless, who came almost never into company, and had been dragged to the infirmary 50. It was supposed only by the double claim of the charity and the promise of the plants, and who had now spent, the whole county presently observed, the entire afternoon of it in the fern corner talking to the Dorset lady from Aldermere. The Duke of Wexbury called at Aldermere for the first time upon the Tuesday of the week after the 50, which Lavinia had not in the least expected, and which set Mrs. Pendlebury into a flutter she had not shown over the baronet nor the lawyers nor the whole business of the will. For a duke was a duke, and the housekeeper had the best service down, and the south parlour aired, before the great man was well out of his plain travelling carriage. But there was no state about the visit. He came, he said, upon a pretext so thin that he did not trouble greatly to disguise it, that he had promised in the marquee to send her a rooted piece of a certain woodwardia from his own stove, and had thought it would travel better carried than sent, and he brought the fern himself upon the seat of the carriage wrapped in wet moss, and gave it into her hands upon the doorstep like a man delivering something of consequence, which to the 2 of them it was. And then, being come, he asked, with the grave directness she was already learning was the whole of his manner, whether he might see the fern house of which he had heard. And Lavinia took the Duke of Wexbury round the dark gable and along the flagged path, exactly as Mrs. Pendlebury had taken her on the first night, and opened the iron door, and let him into the warm, green breathing room that her cousin had built with his own drawings and a Dutchman's iron in the year 1809. And the Duke stepped in, and stood still, as she had stood still, and was silent a long while, as she had been silent, and then said, quietly, "So this is where they live." And Lavinia understood that in the whole of the fashionable world there was perhaps no compliment that could have reached her as that plain sentence did, said by a man looking at the thing itself. He stayed 2 hours. He came again the next week, and the week after, and by the height of the summer, the Duke of Wexbury's plain carriage upon the Bodenham road of a Tuesday was a thing the parish had grown used to, and the county had most emphatically not, and could talk of nothing else. He was not a man who courted as other men courted. There were no flowers sent. Beyond the ferns they were forever exchanging in wet moss, there were no fine speeches, for he had none, and would have scorned them if he had. There was no hurrying. What there was the slow, deep, unmistakable turning of a solitary man toward the one person he had met in 20 years who spoke his own language, and the answering, slower and warier, but no less deep, of a woman who had spent 29 years being not quite seen, toward the first man in her life who had looked at her ferns before he looked at her face, and, having looked at her face, had gone on listening. They walked the coppices together through the long light evenings, and he named the plants she did not know. For his learning was greater than hers and older, and she named the plants he did not. For her eye was truer than his, and he was honest enough and glad to own it. And they argued, comfortably and at great length, over the classification of a doubtful spleenwort and the culture of the filmy ferns, and whether Mr. Ray or the Swede had the better of it, upon a point neither of them could have explained to another living soul. And Lavinia, who had thought the capacity for that kind of talk buried with her cousin in the churchyard at Bodenham, found it come alive in her again week by week, and found, further, and with a wariness that she watched in herself as carefully as she watched a new frond, that she had begun to measure the days between the Tuesdays. He told her, in fragments over that summer, the shape of his own life, which she came to see was in its way as solitary as her cousin's had been. He had married young, a marriage of the family's making, to a lady he had honored and not loved, and who had not loved him, and who had died within 3 years and left him nothing but the title's need of an heir unmet and a large cold house grown larger and colder. And he had turned, as the lonely and the serious will, to the one thing that had never disappointed him, which was the patient looking at the natural world, and had made himself over 20 solitary years a botanist of real note and a duke of almost no society, tending his stove and his correspondence and his great empty house, and expecting nothing further of his life but more of the same, until he had been dragged to an infirmary 50, and had turned up the underside of a hart's tongue frond in a cool corner, and looked up to find a plain gray-eyed woman watching him, who knew, without being told, exactly why he was counting the sorry. He did not say, that summer, in any words what he had come to feel. He was not a man to say a thing before he was sure of it, nor to say it, being sure, in any way that could be mistaken or drawn back. But he showed it. In the only currency the two of them dealt in, he began to bring her not the common ferns but the rare ones, the treasures of his own collection, dividing plants he had guarded for 20 years to give her the half in wet moss, which Lavinia, who understood exactly what it cost a serious grower to have a specimen he had kept alone for 2 decades, received each time with a gravity equal to the giving. And when, in August, he brought her at last the trichomanes he had failed with for 3 years, the very filmy fern they had first spoken over in the marquee, rooted now and thriving because she had told him at the 50 the secret of the water and the shade and the letting alone, and gave it back to her grown strong under her own instruction. She knew, taking the wet moss into her ink-stained hands, that the Duke of Wexbury had said everything a man could say, and had said it in the one language on earth that neither of them could misread. The county, meanwhile, understood the affair in its own coin, and was scandalized and delighted by turns. That the first man in Herefordshire, a duke, a fellow, a widower of the highest consequence, who had refused these 20 years the handsomest and best dowered young women 3 counties could put in his way, should be paying a patient and unmistakable court to a 29-year-old Dorset spinster of no fortune beyond a botanist's house she had inherited by a fluke, and no beauty to speak of. And ink upon her fingers was a thing the drawing-rooms of the county could not for the life of them account for, and accounted for accordingly in a great many ingenious and unkind ways, of which the kindest was that his grace had been touched by the sun at the 50, and the unkindest that the Dorset woman, having got round poor mad Josiah for his acres, was now got round the Duke for his coronet, and was as sharp a schemer as ever counted a leaf. Lavinia knew what was said, for Miss Tabitha, who loved her, could not help sometimes bringing it home from Hereford, red with indignation, and it did not touch her, or touched her only as a draught touches a warm room, felt and shut out. She knew what the Duke came for, and she knew it was not for anything the county had the imagination to suppose. He came for the same reason her cousin had left her the house. Because in a world full of people who read the Latin cards, the two of them turned the leaf to count the sorry on the back. And there is no lonelier nor rarer thing in the world than that, and no schemer alive can counterfeit it. Once, in the middle of that courting summer, the Duke asked her to come and see his own collection, and sent his carriage for her and Miss Tabitha as a chaperone. And Lavinia went the 15 miles across the county to Wexbury for the first time upon a hot still day in July, not without a certain inward bracing, for she had heard all her life of the greatness of such houses, and had never in 29 years set foot in one, and did not mean to be found gaping. She need not have braced herself. The great house, when the carriage came at last up the long avenue and out before it, was everything the county said. Vast and gray and pillared and cold, a house built to overawe and succeeding, but the Duke came down the enormous steps to hand her out himself, in his gardening coat, with earth on his hands, having plainly been at his benches when the carriage was sighted, and led her not into the state-rooms at all, but straight round by a gravel walk to the range of glass houses that lay behind. And there among his stoves and his benches, the great cold house forgotten. The two of them were at home, again within a minute. For a fern house is a fern house whether it stands behind a duke's palace or against a botanist's brick wall, and the plants ask the same things of the hand that tends them, and know nothing of coronets. His collection was larger than hers, and older and richer by far in the costly exotics that only a great purse could gather from the ends of the earth. Whole tribes of tropical kinds that she had known only from the colored plates, and Lavinia went through it slowly, with a growing wonder and a growing tenderness both, for she saw in it, plain as a hand of writing, the 20 solitary years of a lonely, serious man who had poured into these green things the whole of a heart that had nowhere else to go, exactly as her cousin had poured his into the iron house at Aldermere. 2 solitudes, 2 green rooms, 15 miles apart across a county that laughed at both of them, and neither man knowing the other lived. And she saw, too, going through his benches, that for all his learning and his purse his collection was in certain kinds not thriving, that his filmy ferns pined and his maidenhairs went thin, and she told him so gently, and told him why, the water, the shade, the letting alone, the very lessons she had given the children of Bodenham, and the Duke of Wexbury, first man in the county, fellow of the society these 20 years, followed the Dorset spinster along his own benches with a notebook, writing down what she said, and did it without the smallest wound to his pride, with nothing but the pure glad attention of a man being taught a thing he has long wanted to know by the one person who plainly knows it, and Miss Tabitha, trailing after the two of them through the long green ranges quite forgotten, understood, watching them, better than any words could have told her, why the match that scandalized the county was in truth the most fitting that had been made in Herefordshire in a generation, for she had never in her life seen two people so entirely at their ease in one another's company, nor so plainly made, each of them, out of the very stuff the other had gone lonely for want of. They took tea, at the last, not in any of the great cold rooms, but at a plain deal table set for them, by a puzzled footman in the potting shed among the seed trays, and the bast, and the smell of earth, at the Duke's own particular direction, and Lavinia, pouring out, with the July light coming green through the glasshouse roof, and the Duke of Wexbury in his shirt, sleeves across the deal table, telling her of a fern he had lost a whole consignment of, drowned in the Bay of Biscay, understood that she was being shown as plainly as a grave and undemonstrative man knew how to show a thing, the exact life he was offering her. Not the staterooms and the pillars and the cold gray front, but this, the potting shed and the deal table and the shirt sleeves and the green light and the endless comfortable talk of the thing itself. And she found, pouring out his tea among the seed trays, that it was the only life in the whole world she had ever wanted, and that she had very nearly not let herself believe it could be hers, and that here it was, offered across a deal table by a man with earth on his hands, and it was on the long drive home to Aldermere that evening, with Miss Tabitha nodding asleep in the corner of the carriage, and the red Herefordshire hills going gold and then gray in the last of the light, that Lavinia Musgrave admitted to herself, fully and without any of her old careful hedging, that she had come to love the Duke of Wexbury with the whole of a heart that had schooled itself for 29 years to want nothing, and having admitted it, she did not draw back from it in the old way, but sat with it quietly the 15 miles home, turning it over as she would turn a new frond, learning the shape of it, letting it be true. She did not speak of it that summer to a living soul, not even to Miss Tabitha, who guessed the whole of it and had the good sense to say nothing. But it altered her, quietly, in ways the household marked without knowing the cause. Mrs. Pendlebury observed that the mistress sang about the fern house now, under her breath, of a morning, which she had never done that first hard winter, that she stood longer than her work required at the south library window when the plain carriage was due upon the Bodenham road, and that she had taken of an evening to reading over one particular passage of her cousin's old letter, the part about the fourth sheet, and about a man knowing his own when he saw it at $1 the sheet, as though there were some fresh comfort in it lately that there had not been before. And once, on a wet August afternoon when the Duke had been kept away by his mother's illness and no carriage came, Mrs. Pendlebury found the mistress standing in the fern house among the divided crowns, doing nothing at all, only standing, with her ink-stained hand resting upon the woodwardia he had given her in wet moss upon that first Tuesday, the very first fern he had ever brought her. And the old housekeeper, who had buried one master and feared the ruin of everything and lived to see it all come right, went away again softly and did not disturb her, and said to herself in the passage, 31 years. And I never thought to be so glad of anything as I am of that woman standing in a glasshouse missing a duke on a wet Tuesday. And she was right to be glad, for it was the truest sign in the world of a thing that had grown, all that green summer, past any prudence or any schooling, and had only now, like the ferns themselves, to wait upon its proper season to come at last into the open air. There was one who watched the Duke of Wexbury's carriage upon the Bodenham road of a Tuesday, with a bitterness that grew through that summer into something very near to hatred, and that was Sir Goderic Fawkes, across the boundary wall at Fawkes. It was gall enough to the baronet to have lost Aldermere to the Dorset spinster. It was a second and a sharper gall to have lost it, as the county told the tale, by being lectured upon botany in his own cousin's library and sent home with his Latin motto hung up wet, but that the woman who had done these things to him should now, within the 12-month, be on the very edge of becoming a duchess, of rising at a single stroke immeasurably above the encumbered baronet, who had thought to pension her off at £80 a year, was a thing Sir Goderic Fawkes could not swallow and did not mean to. And being a man who could not strike at a thing openly, having tried the law and been beaten by it, he did the thing such men do, and struck at it by the side through the ear of the Duke. He contrived that September to be much in the Duke of Wexbury's way, and finding the Duke, as all the world was finding him. Disposed to speak of nothing so readily as of the lady at Aldermere, Sir Goderic began, with the wounded delicacy he did so well, to let fall in his grace's hearing the history of the affair as he wished it understood, how the melancholy business of poor Josiah's will had divided the family, how the old man in his solitary decline had been, it was widely felt, not entirely his own master, how the Dorset lady, a stranger, unknown to any of them, had appeared from nowhere at the 11th hour to carry off an estate that generations had looked to see kept in the male line, and how she had since, he was grieved to say, shown herself a person of a very managing and acquisitive disposition, had put the whole county under a kind of enchantment with her ferns and her charities, and was now, he feared, his grace would forgive an old family friend for speaking plainly out of pure regard, casting her nets a good deal higher than a botanist's glasshouse. He said it well. He had said it in various forms to half the county, and half the county, loving a scandal, had half believed it. He had not, however, reckoned with the particular nature of the man he said it to. The Duke of Wexbury heard him out to the end, gravely, without interruption, in the way he heard everything, so that Sir Goderic was encouraged to lay it on the thicker, and when the baronet had quite done and stood waiting, with the air of a man who has done a difficult duty by a friend, the Duke was silent a moment, and then said, in his quiet, even voice, Sir Goderic, may I ask you one question? You have known these ferns of hers, the collection at Aldermere, longer than I. You were, I think, often at the Grange in your cousin's time. Tell me then, for I have a wager depending on it with myself, the name of the filmy fern she keeps under the third bell glass upon the middle bench. I could not for my life recollect it, and I know she told me. And Sir Goderic Falkis, who had been at Aldermere perhaps thrice in 10 years, and never once looked at a fern, and who could no more have named the trichomanes under the third bell glass than the far side of the moon, opened his mouth, and shut it, and colored, and said something about not pretending to his cousin's odd learning, and the Duke of Wexbury looked at him with the grave still attention he gave to a doubtful specimen, and said, No, I thought not, and I will tell you, Sir Goderic, since we are speaking plainly out of regard, what I have learned in a summer of that lady, which is that she is the one person of my acquaintance in 20 years who cannot be got to say she has seen a thing she has not seen, nor to name a plant she does not know, nor to pretend to a feeling she does not feel for any consideration on this earth, and that a woman so made is the last woman living who could be the schemer you would have me think her, and the first I have met in my life whom I could trust past the end of the world. And I am obliged to you for your regard, and I will trouble you not to exercise it again upon this subject. Good day. And he left Sir Goderic Falkis standing in the road with his slander dead in his mouth, and drove on to Aldermere, and that was the end of the baronet's last engine. For a man who has been beaten at law and at botany and at malice, all three by the same quarter, learns at length to keep to his own side of the wall, and Sir Goderic Falkis troubled the mistress of Aldermere no more, and was reduced at such dinners as would still have him, to hinting darkly that he could and he would, which nobody attended to, and drinking rather more of his own indifferent claret than was good for his gout, and watching from his encumbered acres the lights of the Grange across the valley with an envy that did him no credit, and his estate no good. He did not go to the wedding. He was not asked. Lavinia, when the Duke told her of the exchange, which he did plainly, keeping nothing from her, as was his way, was silent a while, and then said only, he never did look at the ferns, 40 years next door, and he never once looked, and, I think, when I am very old, that will seem to me the saddest thing I know of him. Sadder than the greed. For the greed a man may repent, but a man who has walked past the true undersides of the leaves all his life and never once turned one to see, has starved himself of a thing that was free upon his own land the whole time, and does not even know that he is starved. And the Duke of Wexbury, hearing her say it, looked at her a long moment across the fern house bench in the September light, and Lavinia looked up and caught the look, and there passed between them, over the divided crowns of a woodwardia in its wet moss, a thing that neither of them yet said, but that both of them, from that afternoon, knew was only waiting upon its season, as the ferns waited upon theirs. The Duke of Wexbury asked Lavinia Musgrave to be his wife upon a still, gold afternoon at the very end of October, a year and some weeks after the letter had reached her at the Dorset breakfast table, and he asked her, fittingly, in the fern house. He had come upon his Tuesday, and they had done the round of the benches together as they always did, she showing him the autumn state of the tender kinds and the tree ferns settling for their winter rest, and there had fallen between them one of the long, comfortable silences that were the truest sign of how it stood with them. For they were two people who did not need to be forever talking, and it was in the middle of that silence, both of them bent over the raised bed of tufa where the maidenhair grew, that the Duke straightened, and stood a moment with his brown, capable hands still, and said in his quiet, even voice, but with something under the evenness that she had not heard in it before, "Miss Musgrave, I am going to say a thing to you, and I have thought a great while how to say it, and I find in the end I can only say it as I would say anything true, which is plainly, and I must beg you to bear with me if I say it ill, for I have had no practice at it these 20 years, and did not think to have the occasion again in my life." Lavinia went still, in the way that made strangers think her cold, and did not help him, and did not look up from the maidenhair, because her heart had begun to beat in a manner that she did not choose to let into her face until she was sure. He said, "I am 45 years old, and I have a great cold house that has wanted a mistress these 20 years, and a name that I know very well is a large part of what you must weigh, and that I would to God I could set aside for this half hour and come to you plain Percival Wexbury with a stove and a bad hand at the filmy ferns. For it is as that man, and not as the Duke, that I am asking. But a man cannot take off his name like a coat, and so I ask you as I am. I have known since the June afternoon that I turned up a hart's tongue in that marquee and found you watching me, that I had met the one person in the world who sees as I see, and I have known since a good while before this that I do not wish to look at anything further in this life, a fern or a folio or a summer evening or the inside of my own great empty house, unless it is with you. I am not a young man, and I cannot offer you a young man's raptures, and I think you would not thank me for them if I could. I offer you my name, and my house, and my collection, which is yours already in everything but the moving of it, and the whole of a serious man's serious regard, which I have never in my life given to any living creature until you, and will never give to any other while I breathe. I am asking you to marry me, Lavinia. I have wanted to ask you since August, and I have made myself wait until the season was right, as one waits with the ferns, but I find I can wait no longer, and I would rather be answered, whatever the answer, than go on another week not knowing. There, it is said, and said ill, and I am wholly at your mercy, and there is a maidenhair between us, which is perhaps as it should be." She looked up then, and the Duke of Wexbury, who had faced the whole matter with the grave steadiness of a man facing a thing he could not govern, saw that the plain gray eyes he had come 15 miles of a Tuesday all summer to look into were full, brimming, though her voice when it came was level enough, and Lavinia Musgrave said, "Your Grace, I am going to answer you as plainly as you have asked, for I think we have neither of us any other coin, and I would not begin with you in a false one. I have 11 pounds of my own in the world, or I had a year ago, and a box of pressed ferns, and I have been all my life a person that other people found useful and did not trouble to see, and I made up my mind a great while ago, being a sensible woman and no beauty, that I should live and die a spinster keeping some other body's house, and I schooled myself not to want otherwise, because a woman who wants what she has been told she cannot have wastes her one life in the wanting. And then a dead man I never met left me a house because I had counted the sorry on the back of a leaf as they truly are. And then a living man crossed a marquee to count them too. And I find, Your Grace, that all my schooling has come undone in a summer, and that I do want, past any prudence, the thing I never let myself want, which is not your name, though I will carry it as carefully as I carry everything, and not your house, though I will warm it if I can, but you, plain Percival Wexbury, with a stove and a bad hand at the filmy ferns, the one man in 29 years who looked at my ferns before he looked at my face, and then went on looking, and so my answer is yes, and yes, and I will be your wife, and I only ask that you will not mind that I am crying, for I have not cried above twice in 10 years, and I find I have got out of the way of it, and cannot at present stop. And the Duke of Wexbury took her ink-stained hands in his brown ones across the bed of maidenhair, very gently, as he took a fern he meant to keep, and did not kiss her yet, but stood holding her hands in the warm green breathing room and looking at her with the whole of his grave still attention, as though she were the truest drawing of a thing he had ever seen set down by any hand in England. And he said, "I do not mind it in the least. Cry as long as you like. We have all the time there is." And then, after a while, when she was quieter, he did kiss her, once in the fern house, among the divided crowns and the wet moss and the tender exotics settling for their winter rest, and outside the iron door, where she had come with a message and stopped, and could not for her soul have gone away again. Miss Tabitha Coyne pressed both hands to her mouth, and turned and ran up the flagged path to the kitchen to tell Mrs. Pendlebury, who sat down very suddenly in the Windsor chair by the range, and put her apron to her eyes and said, 31 years I kept this house, and I never thought to see a duchess made in the fern house. But if ever one was to be, please God, it is that one, that came dusty off the coach and asked to see the ferns before she asked to see her fortune, and Mr. Trewin, told of it at the door an hour after, by his own wife, took off his hat in his own kitchen for no reason he could have given, and put it on again, and said, "Well," and went out to look a while at the master's oaks in the last of the light, that were not sold, and would not now ever be, and stood under them until it was dark. They were in no hurry to be married, being neither of them young nor foolish, and there was besides a decent order in things that suited them both, so that the betrothal ran on through the back end of the year and into the winter, and the Duke came now not upon the Tuesday only, but upon what days he would, and the two great empty solitudes that had been his house and her house began that winter to lean toward one another and grow warm. There was a person whose approval had to be asked, or if not asked, at least awaited, and that was the Dowager Duchess of Wexbury, the Duke's mother, a very old lady of upward of 80 who lived retired in the dower house upon her son's estate, and had long ago given over any hope of seeing him married again or the succession mended, and whom the county confidently expected to be the ruin of the whole affair. For what should a dowager duchess of the old high school make of a Dorset spinster, with ink on her fingers and no more blood than a curate's daughter can boast? And the Duke, who loved his mother and knew her better than the county did, took Lavinia to the dower house one December afternoon with no more ceremony than if he had taken her to see a fern, and the old lady, who was nearly blind now and sat close by her fire wrapped in shawls, had Lavinia brought to a chair at her knee, and held her hand, and felt it, the ink-stained capable hand, between her own two old ones, and asked her not one question about her family nor her fortune, but only, after a long while, in a thin, high voice, "Child, my son tells me you can keep a filmy fern alive. His father could never do it. Nor his father, nor he, is it true?" And Lavinia said, "It is true, ma'am, and I will teach him the way of it. It is only a matter of the water and the shade and the letting alone." And the old dowager duchess laughed, a small, dry, rustling laugh like leaves, and said, "The letting alone, there is the whole secret of everything. And it has taken me 80 years to learn it, and you have it at 29. Percival, she is worth 10 of the young women you would not have. Marry her before Lady Day, and bring me the first grandchild you can contrive, and let an old woman feel its head before she goes." And that was the whole of the great dreaded interview with the dowager, who was as glad of her son's late happiness as any mother, and had only wanted, being old and near her end, to be sure the woman was real, and had satisfied herself of it in the one particular that could not be counterfeited. The banns were called in the little grey church of St. Michael at Bodenham upon 3 Sundays of January, by Mr. Bramwell, whose voice shook the first Sunday, and was steadier the second, and rang out the third across a church so crowded that the parish stood along the walls and out into the porch to hear it. For the whole valley had taken the match to itself as its own doing and its own glory. The Dorset lady that kept the old master's ferns and roofed the cottages and taught their children to see, going up to be a duchess out of their own church, and when Mr. Bramwell read the third time the names of Percival, Duke of Wexbury, bachelor of the parish of Wexbury, and Lavinia Musgrave, spinster of this parish, and asked for the third time whether any man knew cause or just impediment, there was a silence in the little church so deep and so glad that the miller's youngest, held up on his father's shoulder at the back, said clearly into it, "No, there bain't," which broke the whole congregation into a laughter that was half tears, and Mr. Bramwell had to wait a good while, smiling, before he could go on. She was married upon a bright cold morning in the first week of February, upon a day of thin gold winter sun and a hard blue sky, and frost still white in the shadow of the yews, in the church of St. Michael, where she had taken her place that first empty Sunday a little over a year before, a stranger up from Dorset whom the parish had come to look at. She did not marry in state. She wore a gown of dove-grey silk, well made, but plain, and a bonnet trimmed by Miss Tabitha's own hands, and she carried, in place of any hothouse flowers, a small clothes posy that she had made herself the evening before out of the winter-green fronds of her own fern house, the hart's tongue and the hard fern, and a sprig of the maidenhair, bound with grey ribbon. And Mr. Trewin, who had no more right to the office than any man, and a better than most, for he had fed the fires that kept her ferns and hers alive when she was 200 miles away and unknown to him, gave her away, in a new coat that his wife had made him buy, and did it with his weather-dark face held so sternly still against its own feeling that Mrs. Pendlebury wept for the two of them. The church was full past its walls. The estate was there, every soul of it, the roofed cottagers and the honest miller and the reformed idle tenant and the widower with his 5 children scrubbed and wondering. The parish school was there entire. 30 children in their best, each of them, by their own solemn agreement and quite without the mistress's knowledge, carrying a single frond of fern gathered from their own lanes and walls, so that when the new married duchess came out from the porch upon her husband's arm into the thin gold light, the children lined the churchyard path from the door to the light gate and held up their ferns as she passed. 30 green fronds lifted in 30 cold small hands, the Hart's Tongue and the Polypody and the Walrue of Bodenham parish, the wealth that God had strewn for nothing along their own lanes, and that the lady up at Aldermere had taught them to see. And Lavinia, Duchess of Wexbury, walking down that path between the lifted ferns with her husband's arm under her hand and the frost bright in the yews, and the whole valley she had not known a year ago, gathered glad about her, understood that she had been given at 29 out of a shilling folio and a dead man's letter, not a fortune only, nor a name only, nor a husband only, but the one thing she had schooled herself never to want and never thought to have, which was to be, in a whole parish and by a whole valley and by the grave good man beside her, at last and past, all doubting. Seeing the Duke felt her hand tighten upon his arm, and looked down and saw the tears standing again in the level gray eyes, and this time did not tell her to cry as long as she liked, for they were in company. But he laid his own brown hand over hers upon his sleeve, and pressed it once, and understood, being of her own kind, everything that she did not say. And so they came down through the lifted ferns to the light gate together, out of the church of St. Michael into the first morning of the rest of it. A year passed, and a little more, and the marriage settled into the shape that both of them had known from the first it would take, which was not the shape the county had predicted. The county had supposed that the Dorset spinster, raised at a stroke to a duchess, would shut up the queer little botanist's house at Aldermere and remove in triumph to the great seat at Wexbury, and be seen no more among the ferns and the coppices and the roofed cottages of Bodenham, and the county was, as usual, entirely wrong. For the Duke and Duchess of Wexbury, being two of a kind and neither of them fond of great cold state, made of their two houses one life, and divided it between them by the seasons and the plants and their own quiet preference. And Aldermere was not shut up nor sold nor let fall, but kept whole, exactly as its last owner had prayed in his will that it should be. They lived the greater part of the winter and the spring at Wexbury, where the Duke's great stove and his correspondence and the old blind dowager in her dower house all had their claims. But they came to Aldermere for the long light of the summer and the gold of the autumn, and the Duchess came oftener than that, whenever the Fern house wanted her, which was often, for she would trust the tender kinds to no other hand for long, and the two of them worked the summers through in the iron fern house that Josiah Merrick had built with his own drawings in the year 1809, side by side over the divided crowns and the wet moss, the Duke's learning, and the Duchess's truer eye, until between them they made of that small collection a thing spoken of, in time. Wherever in England men turned a leaf to count the sorry on the back of it, and named it, in the papers they published jointly and modestly to the society, the Aldermere Ferns, so that the dead botanist's 40 years of solitary looking went out at last into the world under his own house's name, which was the only monument he had ever wanted and had not lived to raise himself. She did not sell the oaks. Mr. Trewin grew gray in her service and the estates, and the coppice kept its rotation, and the marked trees came down in their turn for the mending of the cottages and no others, and the greater wood stood, as it had stood 100 years, over the damp bottoms where the royal fern grew. And Mrs. Pendlebury kept the housekeeper's keys until she was too old to carry them, and then gave them, with her own hands and her own blessing, to Miss Tabitha Coyne, who had grown from the round, shy orphan of that first winter into a capable woman and married, in the fullness of time, Mr. Bramwell the curate, so that the mild fern-loving parson and the warm-hearted companion made a match of it, under the Duchess's roof and settled at Bodenham for good, and the two who had been the whole of Aldermere's small company in the first hard winter became the whole of its glad one. And in the south library, above the chimney-piece where the heart's tongue of the fourth sheet had hung when first she came, the Duchess made a change, the only one she ever made in that room. She moved her own drawing to the wall beside the window, where she could see it at her work, and in the place of honor above the hearth she hung, instead, two things together in one wide frame: her mother's little unsigned girlhood book of ferns, open to the pressed heart's tongue of a Dorset lane, and beside it the brown and ancient frond marked in a round girl's hand. For Josiah, 1774, the sister cast out and the brother left behind, the two green Merrick children of the old coppices, brought home at last, and hung side by side above the fire in the house that had been the cause of parting them, and was now the proof of their reunion. And beneath the frame she set a small brass plate, engraved to her own direction, that read only. They looked at the thing itself, which was the whole of the family history, and needed no more. The old Dowager Duchess had her wish, though she had to wait a little past her patience for it. Upon the warm, pale gold morning of the 4th of May, in the year 1818, 1 year and 3 months after the wedding, their first child, a daughter, was christened Honoria Lavinia Wexbury in the church of St. Michael at Bodenham by the Reverend Miss Bramwell, with Miss Tabitha, now Mrs. Bramwell, standing as godmother, and Mr. Hetherington, the old solicitor, much moved and much aged, standing as godfather, and the old blind dowager, carried the 15 miles from Wexbury in a well-sprung carriage against every advice of her physician, sat in the Aldermere pew, and held the child a long while against her breast, and felt its small head with her old fingers, as she had asked to do, and said, in her thin, high, rustling voice, so that all the church heard her, "There, now I have felt it, and it has a good head, a Merrick head. Mind the ferns of it, and let me go home." And she lived, in fact, another 2 years and more, and saw the child begin to walk in the Aldermere coppices, with a tin box, which was more than she had dared to hope, and died content. They named the girl for the two women who had drawn the ferns before her, the exiled great-great-aunt Honoria and the cast-out grandmother whose name was the same, and for her mother the Duchess, so that the name carried the whole line in it, and the child grew, as such children in such houses do, and was forever out in the damp bottoms of the greater wood, with a tin box and an ink-stained finger, the 5th of the green Merricks, and could tell a lady fern from a male fern before she could well read, and pressed her first heart's tongue at 6 years old badly, and was praised for it past all reason by a grave, grey-templed father, who kept the poor smudged sheet in his own folio to the end of his life. And the Duchess of Wexbury returned to Aldermere every spring of her long life, and every spring she planted something with her own ink-stained hands in the warm shelter of the walled garden. A fern got from a far county or a crown, divided from the house's own oldest stock, and the portrait of the two green children hung above the south library fire. And the £4,000 was never touched but for the roofing of cottages and the schooling of the poor. And the oaks stood, and the fern house breathed its green breath through every winter warm and whole, kept alight morning and evening, world without end, in the fashion that her own true mother had kept the green things all her 2 short days, and her great-uncle after her in his long solitude. And now she, coming up behind her through the coppices, with a tin box in her small hand, the child who would keep them after she was gone,